Hi everyone. So to talk about the coexistence dilemma, hopefully you can all hear me. To try to get an understanding of the wildlife and domestic animal complexities within our landscape, as well as the challenges that we experience within the fragmented open access protected area that we find ourselves in. So unlike other parks, the Garden Route National Park that's represented here in the dark green, covering about 166,000 hectares, consists of a complex of protected areas that's managed as a single entity. It's surrounded and intertwined by private and other land use with different uses and management practices. The park is unfenced, and it's openly accessible for humans and wildlife to move in and out freely between the areas, basically. So up until the proclamation of the park around 2009, the bulk of the terrestrial areas, which included the indigenous forests and the mountain catchment areas, was managed under the then Department of Water Affairs and Forestry. And these draft managed areas, in some instances, had varying rules and regulations compared to the national parks. And in this, when these areas were amalgamated into the Garden Route National Park, it presented certain challenges. For example, the keeping of domestic animals within our staff villages, managing what happens in the periphery of the park, and so on. The park also spans 2 provinces, 2 district municipalities, as well as 4 local municipal boundaries. The park is nested within a fragmented and multi-use landscape, as I said, and it includes urban settlements, commercial forestry, agriculture and conservation areas, both national and regional. Settlements and rural communities are located immediately next to, nearby, and also within the national park. This is just a visual representation of what this complex landscape looks like. This is taken from Beervlei, one of the forest stations in the wilderness section. So you can see this is from the top. These are the sandbox areas and the plantation areas, and then the private and agricultural areas in that landscape. So it gives quite a nice representation of that complex landscape. So complex road networks exist within the area, which includes forestry, national and publicly accessible roads, along with the numerous trails for hiking and for cycling and for other activities. So if we unpack those complexities just a bit and compare the open access management with that of a fenced park, just keep fenced park in mind. So the physical boundaries are not clearly defined. We've got a more of a hands-off approach when managing wildlife. In some areas, there's increased human-wildlife conflict. Animals freely move between the different areas, and this encourages human-wildlife coexistence. And there's less control to a certain extent of poaching and illegal activity within the area. But not forgetting the complications with res nullius, who actually takes responsibility for the animals that belong to nobody. So to share some Garden Route specific examples, compared to a fence park, as I mentioned, access control is challenging. And these are a couple of examples of road use throughout the park, and in some cases occurring outside of the regulated hours, and you can imagine the impact on wildlife that has changed their behavior to avoid humans. Many green spaces exist within the peri-urban area of the Garden Route landscape, and in some cases creating wildlife corridors and encouraging human-wildlife coexistence. In some instances, conflict, various threats. There are various threats that wildlife face within these peri-urban areas. And there's also other instances of poaching, hunting, as we've heard today, snaring and hunting with dogs, and of course illegal access. As you know, with the 2 major fire events that we've had, managing these natural disasters in a fragmented and peri-urban system can be challenging, but especially considering the conservation management considerations. For example, to what extent are animals' natural movement confined to get away from these threats? But there's also the ethical and animal welfare considerations that we need to keep in mind. like when do we intervene, when don't we intervene, how do we assist injured animals, artificial feeding is a big one, and how much intervention is enough or too much, but taking into consideration all the potential knock-on effects. So this we experienced quite a bit through the major fire event in 2017. There were kind of two schools of thought at that stage, but yeah, just to share that. So there are many domestic animals in and around the park, which influence wildlife in various ways. An example from neighboring communities, some of these animals are malnourished, they're diseased, they are breeding uncontrollably, and this could lead to dogs killing wildlife and also spreading disease. And this is a reality that affects a lot of what's happening on the boundaries of the park, and that of course spills over into the national park. So specifically, with regards to the domestic biota, we recognize that we need to actually start engaging with these challenges and with these issues, and objectives and actions have been identified and captured in the latest management plan. So just to quickly elaborate, so to develop protocol with regards to ornamental and domestic biota, engage with the relevant stakeholders within the landscape to kind of develop and formulate management actions with addressing these things, and also identify where these domestic animals exist and regulate this where needed. So to assist in addressing these challenges and in collaboration with local animal welfare organizations, we have started to gather information on domestic animals from our surrounding communities in and around the park, as well as run some outreach events within these communities, just to basically get an idea of actually what's happening in the landscape, because we don't think we really have much of an idea. And also working with the animal welfare agencies, try to start lessening the impact of some of the things that's happening in the park. They've been quite good with helping us with sterilization programs and helping us to mitigate the spread of disease within these areas. But it's also about creating awareness, but also sharing actually what the impacts are for our wildlife and for our biodiversity at the end of the day. So to end off, we do recognize that this is quite a unique system, and it needs to be managed differently if you compare it to other national parks that are fenced. SANParks jurisdiction doesn't necessarily, or it doesn't actually extend beyond the national park, and we recognize that, and we've got capacity and budget constraints, which is a big reality. So collaboration is important with other conservation agencies that we share the landscape with. There's also confusion amongst the public about the responsibilities of the conservation authorities, and SANParks being a national conservation agency, we're a big role player within the system. But because of the physical boundaries being unclear within this landscape, there needs to be regular communication, there needs to be transparency and awareness about all these complexities within this landscape. That's very important. We do need to, of course, continue to conduct law enforcement activities, but at the same time, we need to recognize that there needs to be a balanced approach with law enforcement and stakeholder engagement, while still understanding the different needs and the circumstances within the areas. So, of course, you see the way forward is not actually that straightforward. There, unfortunately, is no definitive solutions, and there's no silver bullet. This is quite a complex system, so thank you.